It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Priscilla J. McMillan, who is an associate of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of the bestseller Marina and Lee, and she has written a number of articles which have appeared in such publications as the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, Harper's Magazine, Scientific American, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, where she's a member of the editorial board. Priscilla will be speaking about her book, The Ruin of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Birth of the Modern Arms Race. And I also should mention at this point that today's lecture is being recorded for the WGBH Forum. So without further delay, again, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Priscilla McMillan. How's this going to be?
Thank you very much for coming today, a holiday, and I'm especially glad to be here because Boston had quite a tradition with respect to the nuclear energy program during World War II and afterward. As you know, Mr. Conant was one of the directors of the wartime atomic project, as was Vannevar Bush, and later on Robert Cutler, who probably people in this audience can remember, was Eisenhower's national security advisor and very much involved in the Oppenheimer hearing and its aftermath. Another reason I'm glad to be here today is that a biography of Oppenheimer won the Pulitzer Prize yesterday, and I wanted to say that we are all friends who've been working in this field because we've had to think our way around government secrecy. And so instead of competing, we've all helped each other. And there's more to that story later on because the government secrecy issue has become very much more pressing as we come to know in the last few weeks. My book is not at all a biography, but it's angled at more specialized questions. One, at the buildup of nuclear weapons, which is troubling us in the world today, the excess of weapons which now exist in many, many countries. My book starts in 1949 when the Russians tested their first atomic bomb, and there was a debate, very secret, not more than 100 people in Washington found out about it even afterward, very limited behind closed doors, as to whether the United States should respond to the loss of its atomic monopoly by developing the next big weapon, the hydrogen bomb. The key thing about the hydrogen bomb was that our scientists at that time had been trying to figure out how to build it for 7 years, and they didn't know how. They didn't know if it was possible. And there was very much of an internal discussion, and of President Truman's 14 scientific advisors, 10 opposed the building of the H-bomb. Another one abstained, and another one initially opposed and then came to favor it. and the two atomic energy advisors who favored development of the hydrogen bomb were not scientists. So the opposition to building it was almost unanimous among the president's scientific advisors, and Oppenheimer was later blamed for having supposedly manipulated the others into opposing. But in fact, the strongest opponent of the H-bomb in 1949 and 1950 was President Conan of Harvard, to whom Oppenheimer looked really as a father. He called him Uncle Jim. If you're interested later, I will lay out the reasons why the scientists opposed building the hydrogen bomb. But I will mention that at that time, very few people knew much about nuclear weapons, including the president and the Secretary of Defense and all the people in the Pentagon. They knew it was very destructive and that the hydrogen bomb would be 1,000 times the explosive force and 10 times the destructive radius of the atomic bomb. But the properties of nuclear weapons were not understood even by the military at that time. The second part of my book has Truman, to go back, ordered, after this very, very secret discussion, Truman went ahead and ordered the country's scientists, rather funny thing because they weren't necessarily working for the government, but he ordered them to develop the hydrogen bomb as rapidly as they could. This was after 7 years of failure, and he committed the country publicly to building a weapon no one knew how to build, and he ordered that everything about the discussion that had preceded his order be kept secret. He also signaled to the Russians by means of his announcement that we were going ahead, and this caused them to speed up their effort to develop the hydrogen bomb too. The next part of my book was about how the scientists at Los Alamos actually did figure out a way to build the hydrogen bomb and test it, which is always the key thing. And for this, I spent many very happy months at Los Alamos talking with scientists who, by this time, they were glad to talk to historians because for many, many years, everything they did had been shrouded in secrecy. But when I started interviewing scientists, the year was 1986, and classification was still very, very strict, and they would have to stop and remember what was in the published literature before they would answer my questions. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, they became much more, they didn't pause so much. They felt they could be more frank. And the issue at hand was authorship of the hydrogen bomb concept. By that time, Edward Teller, a Hungarian physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project but had devoted much of his scientific life to thinking about the hydrogen bomb and wanting to develop it. Teller, by 1986, had really sold the Strategic Defense Initiative to the Reagan administration. And the scientists at Los Alamos were very angry at him. I swore that I wasn't going to get caught up in the disputes over Edward Teller, but I did inevitably, because the issue was who had really broken the logjam, the conceptual logjam in building the H-bomb. And it was, Teller had ridden his reputation as father of the H-bomb into a position where he had a great deal of influence in the government. I would like to mention that the development of the H-bomb in this country was extremely tied up with the development of computers, that it's kind of hard to imagine either having come on as quickly as they did without the other. And the Russians, by the way, did the same computational work without computers, but ours came online around 1951. The number of mathematical computations that had to be done to develop a thermonuclear bomb is said to have equaled the sum total of mathematical computations or calculations that had been done in the history of the world up until that time. So it was just interesting, the interconnection in scientific advances and the extent to which the weapons program was responsible for other advances that have made all the difference to us in civilian life, too. And the last part of my book has to do with the Oppenheimer hearing itself. And I wanted to talk about that today because it is an example. This took place in the spring of 1954 at the height of McCarthy's ascendancy in American politics. And I see it as a precursor to some of the events we've been living through, an example of the way in which the government used fear, in that case of communism at home and abroad, to violate citizens' civil liberties. And today, something of the same is happening. And therefore, I think the Oppenheimer case is quite a precursor of events that we are living through. I thought I would tell the story by describing some of the people whom I met and who played a role in invention of the H-bomb. The first, and perhaps the most colorful, was a Polish mathematician named Stanislaw Ulam. His brother Adam was a figure in the Harvard government department for many, many years. And Adam always felt that he was in the shadow of his older brother, who was indeed a very considerable mathematical genius. And Stan Ulam had come to the U.S. during the 1930s. He was a junior fellow at Harvard and then went to teach at Wisconsin when he was asked by his close friend, the mathematician John von Neumann, to come to Los Alamos. Like others, he wasn't told what he was to work on, but in fact, he wasn't told where he was going, except that he was a very smart man, and he went to the relief project of the WPA project on New Mexico history, and he found that everybody, all the other physicists and mathematicians at Wisconsin had signed out the same book. And so he knew that he was going not only to New Mexico, but to Los Alamos. He was a very, very handsome man. He was reputed to be lazy. And, but I never saw him stop. When I'd go to dinner at his house in the early 80s, he always had little mathematical toys on the coffee table before dinner. He never stopped working out puzzles, even though the dinner guests were there. He didn't draw attention to it. It's just that his mind was always at work. Ulam was very close to von Neumann. They both had similar backgrounds. They'd grown up, von Neumann in Hungary, and Ulam in Lviv, Poland, but they were both third or fourth generation Jews of Eastern European descent. They understood each other's backgrounds. And the strange thing is that although von Neumann was probably the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, he deferred to Ulam and considered him the more original of the two. And the two of them figured out how to build computers. This was not a dual operation only, and all these operations involved many other people. But they were the two who really solved the problem of building computers. And later on, they devised something called the Monte Carlo method, which is a way of using computers with statistical sampling to figure out any number of mathematical problems. And Monte Carlo is still used by banks and businesses now as a way of handling their financial computations. It was called Monte Carlo because they named it because Ulam's uncle in Poland used to borrow from everyone to finance his gambling forays onto the Riviera. And this method involved tossing of dice. And so there was always this humor among these scientists. It was kind of a special humor, and you have to be tuned into it a little bit. But it's that the careers of these two men were very closely tied together. But when Ulam thought of the way to build the hydrogen bomb, von Neumann was a little bit shamefaced that Ulam had once again been more original than he was. And Ulam probably was the only close friend that von Neumann ever had. But my point here is that Ulam was for many years excised from the history books. His name was excised from the Oppenheimer transcript. Because the invention of the H-bomb and everything about it was very, very secret. And Edward Teller, in that atmosphere, was able to parlay his role in invention of the H-bomb into that of the sole creator. His contribution was very great. He added the element of using radiation from an exploding atomic bomb inside a bigger bomb to set off thermonuclear fuel and make it burn. But it was Ulam who thought of putting two bombs in one bigger bomb and using the result of the detonation of the smaller atomic bomb to detonate thermonuclear fuel and make it burn. So I've said that Ulam thought of 2 of the 3 successful ideas, and Teller thought of a 3rd very crucial one. But to tease out those facts at a time when they've all been classified will take some doing. And I couldn't see the famous document in which the concept was laid out, and I never have seen it. But mathematicians at Los Alamos, after the year 2000, one elderly mathematician in his 80s, he would talk with me, and then he would run over to the theoretical building where the Ulam-Teller paper was kept classified, and he would come back and try to tell me what was in it. And it was all drawings, and it was quite difficult. But they let him do it. And later on, they just told him that I mustn't thank him too much in my book. That I should just thank him as if he'd helped me like anybody else, but not as if he'd been running back and forth and explaining the device to me. But I'm not alone, because Hans Bethe, the great Cornell physicist who later coaxed the drawings from the Ulam-Teller paper into a workable test design for the H-bomb, he never saw the paper until the late 1980s. So you can see that many and very amusing are the ways of government classification and of the scientists who had very little respect for it, but although they had to observe it. Well, the Oppenheimer hearing was a case of a rigged jury, if ever there was one. It was not a legal, a civil trial. It was not a personnel security hearing such as the Atomic Energy Commission had for its employees for many years. It was a specially constructed, very secret proceeding in which so many illegalities were committed that it's difficult to list them all. In 1983, the year I started my book, I had 3 very long interviews with an FBI agent, retired, in California named Charles Bates. And he had been the liaison between the Atomic Energy Commission and the FBI throughout the hearing. And he had carried the wiretaps that the government had made of Oppenheimer's conversations with his attorneys from the FBI over to the Atomic Energy Commission, where the wiretaps would be used in the questioning of Oppenheimer during the hearings. And I, being a rather innocent person, wandered into Mr. Bates's office in Redwood City, California. The first thing I saw was he'd been retired for quite a few years from the FBI, a larger-than-life portrait of J. Edgar Hoover, who he had worshipped and who had been a father figure to him. And I was trying to trace the provenance of the wiretaps into the hands of the prosecuting attorney in the Oppenheimer hearing. But I subsequently learned that he'd actually carried them to the hands of the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Louis Strauss, who would then read them and pass them down to the prosecuting attorney. Bates was quite elusive. I saw him 3 times, including going to dinner with him and his wife. And I think I was so nervous that I totally forgot that I spent 3 sessions hammering away at him. He's now dead. He was a hero of the Patty Hearst case, the Chicago 7, or is it 9? All the terrorist cases in the 70s, and he also managed to get out of Washington in time to avoid becoming the field officer in charge of the investigation of Watergate. He was very adept, and his role in the Oppenheimer case was extremely large. He was then only 29 years old, but much of the communication between the head of the atomic energy and J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was verbal and not committed to paper. But sometimes I could tell what had happened because afterward I would see reports by other FBI officials which would report on Bates's conversations with Louis Strauss. Well, the thing was that Hoover had not been anxious to have Oppenheimer, a security hearing in the case of Oppenheimer. He'd held it off for a long time. He did not think Oppenheimer was a spy. He knew better because he had access to the decrypts of the Soviet government's communications with the KGB, as it was then called the MKGB, offices in New York and San Francisco, and Hoover knew who had and who hadn't been spying. So he knew Oppenheimer was innocent, but he considered him an adulterer, and he didn't like him anyway. But he did not want to have hearings because he was afraid of the response in the scientific community, which was very, very loyal to Oppenheimer. The other thing about Hoover and his role was that he was worried that Louis Strauss, the head of AEC, who hated Oppenheimer and who thought of the whole thing, was going to go too far. Hoover, being a good bureaucrat, wanted to protect the FBI more than he did anything else. And since its methods were illegal, involved the wiretapping of Oppenheimer's conversations with his attorneys, he was very much afraid that something would happen during the hearings, which were held in secret, that would give away the fact that the government was bugging and tapping Oppenheimer's conversations with his lawyers. So the roles of different individuals were not necessarily what they appeared to be. I skipped Louis Strauss. He was head of AEC. He also was the chief trustee of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, which Oppenheimer was the director of. And the occasions for friction between those two men were manifold. But they seemed to manage to deal with each other at the Institute, more or less. But Oppenheimer, Strauss was a man of little formal education. He had been through high school in Richmond, Virginia. He'd become a shoe salesman. He found his way to working for Herbert Hoover in war relief after World War I. Herbert Hoover became his patron and helped him go to work at Kuhn Loeb, banking in New York. And then Mr. Strauss became very, very wealthy. He was extremely sensitive about his lack of education. And on occasion, Oppenheimer had shamed him, both in private or secret government meetings, which the public, of course, didn't know, but also famously in a hearing in the House, HUAC, in 1949. And Strauss, I think after that, was waiting his moment, but the thing that made Oppenheimer vulnerable was his opposition to the H-bomb and the fact that he had been very close to the Communist Party during the 1930s in Berkeley. He always denied that he belonged to the Communist Party, and I believe that that is true, but he'd been very, very close. So the implication was drawn, particularly by Teller, on his many, many visits to Washington over the years, that Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb had been motivated by pro-Soviet sympathies. And Teller dropped this hint at the Air Force, in the U.S. Senate, in other parts of the government, and this played a very large part. But the other big thing was that the Air Force wanted a monopoly of hydrogen weapons, did not want to share them with the Army or the Navy, and it was, to some extent, an inter-service thing, and the Air Force played a very big part in bringing down Oppenheimer and destroying his influence. Which brings me to President Eisenhower, who was coping at that time with the figure of Joe McCarthy. Eisenhower had run for president to keep the Republican Party from falling into the hands of the isolationist wing led by Robert Taft. He spent most of his presidency trying to do that, more than he wanted. He was interested in foreign affairs and in military affairs, and he really wanted, I think, to preside over domestic affairs, but not really engage in politics on the ground. But McCarthy presented him with an awful dilemma, and he didn't want to be seen to be fighting McCarthy openly, but he wanted him destroyed. The Oppenheimer hearing took place behind closed doors near the foot of Capitol Hill in an old building of the Atomic Energy Commission beginning April 12, 1954, and the hearings took place in April and the first part of May, and the verdict was delivered by the Atomic Energy Commissioners at the end of June. So it took place that spring of 1954. And Oppenheimer's, the decision to take away his security clearance was made public June 29th of 1954, the day before his clearance would have expired anyway. Meantime, beginning on April 22nd, 10 days after the Oppenheimer hearing started, and very, very public, were the Army McCarthy hearings, where Eisenhower did get involved because it was his favorite institution, the U.S. Army, that was being attacked. So every night after the Army McCarthy hearing up on Capitol Hill, the Secretary of the Army, Robert Stevens, a textile manufacturer from Massachusetts, not prepared to be Secretary of the Army, would go home by way of the White House and be coached for his part in the very public televised hearings the next day. Oppenheimer would repair to the home of one of his lawyers in Georgetown, and his lawyers would try to figure out their strategy for the next day, except that what they were saying was always known to the prosecution because of the wiretapping. Other things that happened in the course of the hearing, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, Louis Strauss, prepared every one of the prosecution witnesses within a day or so of when they were due to testify. Oppenheimer had, I think, 29 or maybe more witnesses in his defense. They were people like Conan, who was then U.S. High Commissioner in Germany, John McCloy, who was then head of the Chase Manhattan Bank, or maybe it was just the Chase National Bank at that time, George Kennan, David Lilienthal, who had been head of the Atomic Energy Commission. They were people very, very distinguished in American life who'd worked with Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer's defense and his chief lawyer, Lloyd Garrison, assumed that the fact that the people who testified for him were some of the leading figures in American life, that would protect him. The witnesses against him were 7 scientists and 1 person who'd been in the Manhattan Project security. Oh, and 1 person who had been worked for the Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy. And the others were all scientists who had known Oppenheimer in Berkeley, California. That some of them were chemists who disliked Oppenheimer from his time as a professor there in the 1930s. None of them had worked on the hydrogen bomb except Teller. So they didn't really know the physics whereof they were speaking, except for Teller. And Strauss, when I said that he coached them, I went through his diaries and I could see that he'd seen every one of them, like a Tuesday morning, a guy who was going to testify Tuesday afternoon, and then sometimes that person would see Strauss afterward to be congratulated. And this was true of all the scientific witnesses against Oppenheimer. The total witnesses were 8, as against about 30 for Oppenheimer. But the whole trial was arranged so that the defense witnesses would go first, and their testimony would not be as prominent in the minds of the board, which was hearing a testimony, as was that of the hostile witnesses. One hostile witness who did not show up was Ernest Lawrence, who was almost the dean of American science then, or American physics. He was the progenitor of the cyclotron in Berkeley, California. He had promised to testify against Oppenheimer, and at the last minute he did not come. He said because of illness, and that he was ill, but also he didn't want the scientific community to be split as badly as it would have been as it was, in fact, but he didn't want to contribute to such a split in the scientific community. And the person whose testimony was considered to have been the coup de grace was Edward Teller. Teller didn't, Teller's testimony, I'm afraid it was worked out with the prosecutors ahead of time, and he limited his remarks in a way to saying, I personally would feel more secure if Oppenheimer were not cleared. He uttered the key word, which was secure. And he immediately repented of what he'd said, and he went to see Strauss afterwards. Strauss said, you did the right thing. But within weeks, he wanted to give a press conference recanting what he'd said. And Strauss and the chief prosecutor at the hearing talked him out of it about 6 times in the succeeding years. You can find, I found this in Strauss's papers, and Teller's papers are not very available yet. Edward Teller's papers, but in Strauss's papers I could see what passed. How to end? So in the supreme irony was that Oppenheimer's clearance was revoked June the 29th, 1954. The U.S. lost its an advisor on nuclear affairs who had given very good advice over the years, in my opinion. And Eisenhower lost someone. Eisenhower was very glad. He congratulated Strauss. He never saw through it. He thought for the rest of his life that the hearing had been an example of getting rid of a security risk while observing all the niceties of civil liberties. And he never understood what Louis Strauss had been and had done. And he was, therefore, there's members of this audience who know about it, caught very flat-footed when years later Sputnik went up in the air, because he was not used to listening to the best scientists in the American scientific community, and they really had to be wooed back to help the U.S. when it needed them. Oh, I hope you have some questions.
It's the best accounting of anything in that era. The question I had for you was, isn't it a fact in the sense, because there's so many dynamics to it, that when Edward Teller went to Los Alamos, I am from New Mexico, and I know Los Alamos very, very well. When Edward Teller went to Los Alamos, among the other great, brilliant physicists of the world, under Oppenheimer's direction, because after all, he was made the director. He was made the director by Leslie Groves.
Yes.
General Groves,
yeah.
by the way, also testified for Oppenheimer. He was also one of his witnesses at that hearing.
Right.
And Groves insisted, and Groves knew that there were these things, and it was actually Oppenheimer's wife, Kitty, and his affianced before him, Jean Teller, that were really hardcore communists, and Groves knew that. But he also saw the abilities that Oppenheimer had and knew that he was not, quote, a card-carrying communist. He was not, embroiled the way that Oppenheimer's brother Frank was.
Yeah.
But Teller at that time was in the Los Alamos laboratory, and the way I understood it is that when it came time to decide who was going to be head of the theoretical division of physics, that Edward Teller thought that he was going to be the head of that division. And Oppenheimer really gave it a soul-searching, thought-provoking time, and he decided that they should appoint Hans Bethe as head of the theoretical division. That he also, because of his brilliance, but also the way that he could get along with the other physicists. And I just wanted to ask you if that problem with Teller, Oppenheimer, might have started way back at that time, and also the other thing, Teller, anything that I've seen or in Los Alamos, is that Teller wanted to do his
H-bomb.
H-bomb, and isn't it a fact that Oppenheimer said we're working on the A-bomb right now? But didn't he allow Teller, and that was my question, to go ahead and work on the H-bomb? I don't have a problem with that, or am I confused?
Well, Teller had a long history, and it was that he was bored with the problems of the atomic bomb, and he thought they were fundamentally solved. And so he wanted, even during the war, to work on problems of the thermonuclear bomb. How Oppenheimer felt, I don't know, but his secretary, Priscilla Duffield, told me, he set aside an hour every Tuesday afternoon to talk with Teller about his ideas, and he assigned, I think, 12 mathematicians, physicists to work at least part-time with Teller on thermonuclear problems. How Oppenheimer really felt, I don't know, but the other people that I came to know, absolutely, it was bitter because they were going all out to build an atomic bomb and try to end the war, and Teller just sat it out for his own mania. And he had the same obsession for many, many, many years. But it was a mixed thing. He did contribute to the H-bomb. His absolute certainty that it could be done had something to do with when we did it. But the other side of it was he had in his head a certain model, and he forced the laboratory to work on it for 7 years with no result. And it was only when Ulam and Fermi and others broke the logjam, the conceptual logjam, that the right thing could be found. And so Teller really forced the laboratory to work for many years on the wrong thing. And then he went to Washington and told the Air Force and Congress and everybody that Los Alamos was dragging its feet, and it was all because of Oppenheimer's influence. Oppenheimer had almost no influence on the hydrogen bomb program. Yes.
Perhaps you could clarify the confusion in my mind. You said that the hearings were secret and that the decision came down on June 20, 1930. Those of us in the academic community who were involved in this were deeply upset when the decision came down to lift Oppenheimer's clearance. But within weeks, days almost, I wrote to the printing office and I got 900 pages of the transcript.
At the time, right after the hearing and before the Atomic Energy Commissioners had made their decision, Louis Strauss saw that things were going very much against what they were doing. And he thought it would help if the transcript were released in part, with certain bits of it selected and released early. And that's what he did. And he got Fulton Lewis Jr., a radio commentator who was very close to Hoover. He went on the air first with analysis of the hearing transcript. The whole transcript was published after the decision. And then what happened was that the scientists over the summer of 1954 read it. I mean, the people who testified weren't supposed to talk about it outside. I'm sure they did. But they didn't say everything there was to say, and none of them was familiar with more than his particular part. So when they read the transcript, there was a fearful crisis, and other things happened. The point was that Strauss wanted to tear down Oppenheimer and put Teller in his place as the leading scientist. And that attempt was made over the summer of '54, which prompted a press conference by the director of Los Alamos, who declassified Ulam's name, for one thing. Nobody in the room recognized it. And who said, it was Los Alamos that had designed the H-bomb and not the Livermore laboratory, which had by then been set up for Teller. Does that answer you?
Well, yes, it does. I just want to make a sign. One is supposed to spend the summer reading mystery stories.
Yes? Oh. No. Well, I loved that book, and I reviewed it for the Los Angeles Times. But I love the first part, Teller's early life in Europe and his training. Of course, it was very difficult, and the woman who wrote Teller's memoirs for him quit for 4 years because he didn't want to write about the Oppenheimer hearing. She just said she walked off the job. She helped all of us in this business kind of help each other, though. She helped some of us. And Teller lied a lot, and I think I interviewed him 4 times, at least 4 times. And the last time, and he was one of those paranoid people who's not litigious. He doesn't sue you. He couldn't anyway, but he didn't. And he would always see me, even though I had written about him in Scientific American and reviewed his memoirs. He did try to blackball me a little bit, but nothing that really hurt. And I think he said to us in 1993, he said he would see 4 of us, historians, at once at the laboratory and be photographed and recorded. He'd give each one of us an hour, and he wouldn't throw any of us out. He'd answer all our questions, and he wouldn't throw any of us out. And so one of the things he said was, Ulam invented nothing. And I showed him some documents that were around the time of the hearing that were in his handwriting that made a liar out of him. Meant that he'd been lying for however many years, 40, and he just couldn't believe his eyes. And that is my writing, but I don't think I've seen that before. And this went on, and he never got over it, actually. But I don't know why we divided the 4. One did the Manhattan Project, one did the H-bomb, one did the Oppenheimer here. Richard Rhodes did the Oppenheimer. So it was pretty thorough, and I'm not sure he saw any historians after that. Yes.
You had said that if you were interested, tell us why the scientists opposed the creation of the...
Yes. One was that they didn't know if it could be done. Another was, and therefore to commit the country publicly could be very, very embarrassing for the Truman administration. The U.S., because of its 2 long coasts, was more vulnerable to being attacked with an H-bomb than was the Soviet Union. And the scientists didn't want to challenge the Russians to a race to build a bomb to which we were more vulnerable than they were. Another thing is that Truman's announcement did alert the Russians. They did go into high gear, and it became a part of my own thesis of my own book, which I think it's true, but you can argue with it, that we did set the pace in the nuclear arms race rather than the Russians. In the end, we were about 1.5 years ahead of them along the line, but their physicists were just as good as ours. And when we tested an H-bomb on March 1st, 1954, just before the Oppenheimer hearings, the Russians realized that we were onto something new. It was 15 megatons, our test called Bravo, in March 54, and it almost went people were worried that it was going to go out of control. And there was a very embarrassing press conference in which Louis Strauss said it could take out any city in the world, and Eisenhower rebuked him. But that told the Russians that we had a method that they hadn't thought of yet. They were in the same boat we were. They were working on the wrong approach. And when they realized that we had something new, Sakharov and another person thought of the solution very quickly, and they too tested a true H-bomb within a year and a half. Yes.
You haven't mentioned the fact that there were transcripts from the early 40s when Oppenheimer was being examined by the FBI, by the military as to his loyalty to America, and that those transcripts were all used in the hearing, and they were not shown to either Oppenheimer or to his counsel. Mm-hmm. It seems to be another example of an egregious violation. But that leads me to my question. Okay. What is your assessment of Lloyd Garrison?
He was a wonderful person, and in the civil liberties field, there was no one better than he was in the country. But Oppenheimer needed a tough criminal lawyer, and at a certain point, he probably needed to walk out because one witness was trapped. The documents he was going to need for his testimony were purposely removed from the AEC files just before he went into them. There were many occasions, but how do you walk out in a time such as that was, the McCarthy period, when everything was secret? Garrison, yes, he didn't know what he was up against. Nobody did. And even at the very end of his life, I tried to see him, and he would agree to see me, and then he would have a fall. And then he would agree to see me, and then finally, he just couldn't bear it. He wrote me and said, "This is the worst thing in my whole life, and I just can't bear to deal with it again." But I wrote to him. By then, I had done a lot of my research, and I just said, "No, don't worry." He was blind by this time. You couldn't have won no matter what you did. And his wife read it to him, but Oppenheimer, and especially Mrs. Oppenheimer, felt that he had let them down. Oppenheimer didn't tell everybody that. He didn't even tell his secretary. She told me he did not feel let down, but he did. He did. Yes.
You know research as an able Professor Henry Seaman, who was a close friend of Fermi, and he's thought of as having a great deal of influence on both the atomic and Henry Seaman.
Don't know him. No. Is one more in the back?
Could you comment on how events evolved after this that led to President Kennedy restoring Oppenheimer's clearance when he was in the White House?
I didn't accept.
He gave an award to Oppenheimer.
Well, that was Kennedy was a cautious person, and his advisors, McGeorge Bundy and Jerome Wiesner, his science advisor in the 1960s, definitely wanted to rehabilitate Oppenheimer because it was an injustice that rankled within the scientific community, and to some extent it still does. So first Kennedy invited Oppenheimer to a dinner at the White House for Nobel Prize laureates. Oppenheimer had not won the Nobel Prize, but I think Kennedy was testing the waters, and it was a public affair, and Oppenheimer's presence was very much noted. And then in the April of 1963, the White House announced that Oppenheimer was to receive the Fermi Award, which was the U.S. government's highest scientific award. But then Kennedy, and the award was to be given December the 2nd of 1963. By that time, Lyndon Johnson was president, and even Johnson wasn't sure he should do it, and he took aside Clinton Anderson, the head of the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy and senator from New Mexico, and asked him if he should go through with it. So, unfortunately, another thing happened was that Teller was given the same award the year before, and I was recently told by Richard Garwin, a very fine physicist who was around then, that had been the price of getting the award for Oppenheimer, was that Teller get it first. Yes.
I have not read your book, but I assure you I shall read it.
Thank you.
I just want to say I spent many years in Washington after World War II, and I had access to great many top secret files. The most dramatic one was a letter from Einstein to President Roosevelt,
Yes.
outlining to President Roosevelt the possibilities of an atomic bomb. That was top secret then.
Yeah.
I can't remember the date, but I think it was 1940. Not sure.
Right.
Probably will find it in your book.
Well, yes, Einstein later regretted that he'd done it, but he did. He wrote 2 letters to President Roosevelt, and yes, and they were gotten to him by Alexander Sachs, a banker in New York who knew FDR. I would like, before closing, just to say, though, that it was a lot of fun doing the research because of the secrecy. And it made colleagues of all of us who were working on nuclear weapons history. And in fact, there was one man in California who would get, let's say, a given document from Los Alamos, from the Livermore Laboratory, from the Energy Department in Washington, and from a place in Las Vegas, a government storage facility. And he would compare the way that document had been, as they say, redacted, that is censored in each place. And then he would put them together, and we'd have the whole thing. And we, all of us, exchanged our materials, and we even had a committee, of which I was the chairman, of historians advising the Energy Department on what groups of documents they should declassify next to help the most of us. And the only trouble is, I mean, we've been doing that since 1991, but just this last week it's come out that the official of the National Archives, who was our host at these many meetings, himself is the person who signed last fall a paper, a memo of understanding with the Air Force, agreeing to keep secret the fact that many Air Force documents that had been declassified had now been reclassified. And I wondered why this man, Mr. Kurtz, whose name has been in the paper lately, didn't show up for our last meeting. And the archivist of the U.S., Alan Weinstein, is terrifically chagrined because he was not archivist at the time but this has been the Bush administration not only reclassifying documents, but taking great pains to do so covertly. And honestly, that's really why I was so glad to come today.
Marion Schlesinger, who's a great fan of yours.
Oh, I know. What is your name?
Carl Sapers, S-A-P-E-R-S.